Oh, we'll take the young ladies first to 45th and Madison, and we'll take you over to 63rd. Let's take the Midtown Tunnel, 11 million and 3/4. Me?
No, sir. No. I respect you, but you're the driver. Don't have no action.
Now, Manhattan, as you know, also decides divide by the three rivers. The East River to the east, it divides Brooklyn and Manhattan. To the west, it is the Hudson River, it divides New Jersey or Staten Island out of Manhattan. And to the north, it is that way, it is the Harlem River, it divides Bronx out of Manhattan or New England actually. And to the south, it is the East River and Manhattan to get together, and the tunnel or swimming or flight, one of the other two other things you can do. I can do like this.
White balance outside, automatic. Bingo.
Maybe, what about if you walk down the window?
Well, sir, you know, I tried, and this is what I got.
Okay, so I guess you might have put a front down there.
Well,
the front comes down the
all the way? Okay. Me try it this way. And then when we get to our destination, coming back, I'll ride.
Okay.
I told your mother, I said, I'm sorry. Tell your husband I'll pay for his
You told my mother to tell her husband?
I didn't know. I'm sorry.
Oh, before you. Okay.
Yeah, she told me tomorrow.
Can we jump over there?
Ah, and maybe we can get closer to it.
This is St. Mark's over here. This is where that guy was killed. You should do that out front, you know.
You're right.
This way you can lean out.
Right. Oh, you know something about video, eh?
Not really, but, you know. Let me just... Wait. Don't climb over. Don't climb over.
I won't. No, I have a dress on. I may be a tomboy, but I can't do that very well.
Let me just pull over so you can look at the front, look out the window, and all that kind of stuff. Got this little thing come telling somebody else so that we go past him so he doesn't get disappointed. So, okay, let me bring my shoe up front. That.
You don't mind talking to the camera, please?
No, not at all.
Can I get a correct pronunciation of your name?
It's Jerry, J-E-R-I, Warwick, W-A-R-R-I-C-K, Chrisman. Let me write that on the back. Chrisman. Yeah. But I like using, I just didn't use it on this card, I like using first name.
You've had a very wide variety of backgrounds from teaching to media to...
Yes. Government, ownership and government, yeah.
And finally difficult to get out of media. I'm focusing now.
Oh, you're not, this is not running.
Well, it's running, just giving you a good focus.
Oh, okay.
Have it.
All right.
Okay, why don't you start, since it would be easier for me to edit, and you're talking about your advice to young people. You mentioned that the era is over when you just pick one career and stay with it. Could you explain, please?
All right. I feel that in today's world of work, that people must be prepared to change careers very quickly. I think that the era of deciding when you're 15 years old that you're going to be a nurse when you get older and determine that at 65 you will retire as a nurse is not realistic. A person who has nurse's training can be any number of things, to perhaps end up as a hospital administrator. And I believe that if young people are going to prepare themselves for the 90s and going into the year 2000, that they should realize that there are many opportunities, many jobs. They must have certain skills, basic skills that can be transferable, and be willing to make changes. my own experience was that I was prepared to be a teacher because when I came out of college, most young black women were either teachers, social workers, or nurses. That was pretty much it. Not even the professions were as alluring to my generation as they had been to generations after. And I taught school. I was an English teacher, and I decided to get a graduate degree in guidance counseling. I was a guidance counselor. I took a group of students to NBC studios in Chicago in 1964 and was offered a job there, and I sent the students back to school, and I stayed on, and I stayed with NBC for 18 years. I went from working at NBC to being transferred from Chicago to New York, to being in corporate public affairs, to I had an opportunity to buy a radio station in New Jersey, and I took advantage of that and left NBC in 1980. Bought the radio station, ran it for 4 years.
Was it a black?
It was a black-oriented station, the only black station in New Jersey, WNJR, one of the oldest stations in the state, and we had a great deal of success with that station. We were able to raise the rating points to a level where it was very attractive to someone who wanted to buy it, and the price was right, so I sold my interest in the station. And really was planning to do an early retirement when the governor of the state of New Jersey, Tom Kane, invited me to join his administration as the assistant state treasurer. Did that for 3 years and then came to the Port Authority. And here I am. So, if you can see, it was a somewhat checkered career, but I think that the basic skills that I learned in preparing to be a teacher were the same skills that I'm even using today at the Port Authority. And my point is that while it may sound a little mundane, the basic R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, and doing them well are just as important today as they were when I finished college. I'm not as knowledgeable on computers and word processors and all of those things as young people are today, but if I have to learn them, I'm sure I will.
You know, some people feel that blacks, given discrepancy in our English scores, English teachers would use the approach of teaching us English as a second language. Do you think that would be more effective in bringing our scores up? Have you ever heard that theory?
I never heard that theory. I thought you were going to say black English being taught, and of course I'm totally opposed to that. I can't even imagine what they're talking about. But you know, I really believe, when I look at young people today and all of the opportunities, all of the role models they have, television in the home every night, they're able to hear good standard English, they have access to libraries that in the South, I understand many blacks of my generation didn't even have access to. I don't feel that there's any need for any special or remedial anything. I think it requires of a certain attitude towards learning. I think it requires a personal discipline that says this is important. I may have to move away from the gang or from the mainstream in my community, but I want to do something different. I want to change my life, perhaps make it a little better than my parents, and you do it. I'm not sure that I almost resent the thought of remedial anything. I look at the immigrants who come here and the young Vietnamese students who are walking away with the Westinghouse scholarships, for whom English was indeed a second language. And I just don't understand how they're able to do it, other than the fact that there was a great deal of personal discipline and that their focus was perhaps a little different from ours. I read a study once that said that first-generation Americans probably are more motivated and have a greater incentive towards learning than subsequent generations. We perhaps take it for granted. And that could perhaps explain why those who came over recently are doing so well. But I'm not sure that I consider English a second language for young black Americans.
Let's talk about the media. You know, a lot of people are concerned with focus among, since we own the radio station, the black-oriented radio station, focuses just on singing and dancing.
Right.
case of yours, wasn't it?
Absolutely not. I told, after I had taken over the station, I not only owned it, but I was the president and general manager. I told our disc jockeys, our on-air talent, that we had an obligation to our listening audience, and our audience included New York City and Newark. Newark was our city of license, Newark, New Jersey. We had an obligation to do more than let them know what the latest records were, because the latest record today, as we know, in this hit record generation, is unheard of in a week or two. So beyond that, I felt we had an obligation. I had talk shows. I had noonday talk where people called in. We had experts on various issues. I even ran, and we think we were the first black station in the country to do this, I ran a show at midnight, from midnight until 5 in the morning, with a black psychologist, Dr. Gwendolyn Brandt, who also is a columnist for Essence magazine, who lives in Newark. Her husband is on the city council there. And Dr. Brandt came in every night. People called in with problems. And unlike many of the, quote, psychological talk shows, ours focused not only on how to get married or how to get unmarried, but also on how to get housing for family that has been burned out. She had those kinds of problems, and because of her own interest and her own access to agencies within the community, she was able to get right on the phone and get housing and get jobs. We have a major prison in the Newark area called Rahway State Prison, and many of the inmates would call her at night and say they're concerned because their son or daughters are having problems and they're not able to help them. And Dr. Grant, right on the air, would help solve those problems. So we were really pleased. We received several awards for that show. So we did do more than simply notify our listeners as to what the latest records were.
And I'm always interested in people of a different generation. It seems that all the opportunities and hard work that your generation fought for, my generation has yet, some of us have yet to capitalize on it. And when we see the rise in the craft and what it's done to our community, let me ask you straight up, do you feel disappointed in my generation?
I don't feel disappointed. I simply don't envy your generation. I have 2 children, one of whom is probably in your generation, or probably both. And as I looked at them growing up and realized that the decisions they had to make that I never had to worry about. I mean, drugs in the community that I lived in were unheard of. I mean, we didn't even know the names of them. So I didn't have to be concerned with that. The greatest thing might be drinking a can of beer after a football game or something, as relatively innocent as that. Even the question of the sexual revolution had not hit my generation, so I didn't have to make those decisions. I really didn't. I mean, you pretty much knew what your attitudes were about your own body, and you were able to subscribe to those attitudes without too much pressure. When I look at my grandchildren who are inundated with sexually explicit advertising on television, the songs that my 9-year-old grandson sings sometimes because he hears them on the radio. I mean, he doesn't even know what they mean, but he's singing, "I want your body," and not nonsense, And I didn't have to deal with that. Even if you think of the music of my era, they were beautiful, intelligent lyrics, Stardust, and What a Difference a Day Makes, and all those wonderful songs that were more of the high road of life. So I don't envy your generation. I'm not terribly disappointed, but I do have to say in terms of drugs, I think the very liberal attitude that this nation took in the 60s during the anti-war movement, where young men were saying, well, I'm going to die anyhow in Vietnam, so I may as well die happy, so I'm going to experiment. Those chickens are now coming home to roost, and we do have a generation, perhaps, of young people who have experimented with drugs and couldn't stop. And I think even the attitude of the drug culture of previous generations are now repaying for that. And there was some escalation from some so-called recreational drugs to other things, and then, of course, the hard drugs that come in. And when I look at the black community and see that the whole tenor of the black community has changed, because I think because of the drug culture. I'm upset. I lived in Chicago, Illinois, at a time when there was a Skid Row in Chicago, and they were, quote, the people, the dropouts of society, but you never saw black men on Skid Row. Skid Row, right on Madison Avenue, it was a block or two from the Loop, were always white men. You never saw black men. And I used to say black men are too proud to sleep in the street, etc. We've lost all of that. Or that the black community or the black church will take care of our own. That's gone. So we've got a lot to do. I mean, I sometimes, when I look at headlines and realize what has happened in terms of crime, I mean, unheard of crimes, young people burning other young people and so forth, and then discover that they were on drugs. I fear for the next generation, but I think that if we recognize the problems and say it stops here. I believe, as I told my children, I had zero tolerance for drugs. I zero. That meant don't explain to me only once, or I don't know how this marijuana cigarette got in my room. I don't deal with that at all, because I'm calling the police. And I mean, it was rough, but I also was, I think, intelligent enough to know that you don't play with those things, you know. And I think there is a lesson for the next generation to learn. There's no such thing as a recreational drug, because for some people, perhaps a small minority, they can quit. But I used to tell my students when I was a teacher, how many of them that you know really do quit, or how many that you know, if haven't given an opportunity, when they say they quit, won't say, well, just one more time. So I just think that's an area that you just don't play with.
You know, again, I assume that you were familiar with New York, and I assume that you are. You know, what I see, not just in this part of the country, but even in the North and in California, in the area of economic development, the small stores are not ran by black people, they're ran by either Koreans or Lebanese.
Right.
And I see here as I drive around.
Yes, it's absolutely true. And unfortunately, what's happening in New York, there is in Brooklyn a movement by some community activists to try to discourage blacks from shopping in these Korean shops. Apparently there was some incident where a shop owner either shot or attacked a woman who was shoplifting, black woman who was shoplifting, and the community felt that he overreacted, and they simply come up in arms. But I think it's ludicrous, because I do believe that many of these people who've come over to this country are willing to make the kind of sacrifices that I'm not even sure that we want to make. They will sleep 8 in a bed and sleep in the back of the store and get up at 5:30 in the morning. Our generation of life, we've been inundated with the good life, and we aren't really, my mother's generation perhaps would make those sacrifices. You saw washerwomen leaving the home at 5 o'clock in the morning to go and clean and that kind of thing, you know, and working 12-hour days. I'm not sure that African Americans of my generation or even your generation will do that. And the immigrants who come here are willing to live that way. They wear the same suit day in and day out. I think, unfortunately for many of us, when we say we're a small business person, we feel that we have to take on the behavior of a successful business person before we have actually achieved the success financially. I had a friend who was giving grants from a state agency when I was assistant state treasurer, and he said it would amuse him to be able to give a grant to a minority business gentleman, for the most part black, and then when he came back the next week to perhaps pick up something, he had a new Cadillac. He immediately saw himself as successful before the evidence proved that he was, and he began to want to live at that level. And I think that's a mistake that many of our people make. I don't know what we're going to do about it, because we feel, many of us, we paid our dues, and we want to enjoy the good life while we can, but then don't be critical of people who have a different attitude. And I support any small businessman, having owned a radio station and knowing the obstacles of a small business. I support any of them who are willing to make the sacrifice.
So getting back to New York, you now have a black mayor, and the eyes of the world are upon him. Although he did inherit a fiscal problem, what type of mayor do you think Dinkin will be?
Well, I happen to know him personally, and I know his wife socially, and I think, number one, he's a gentleman. In addition to all of his obvious qualities and his technical skills, he's an attorney, as you know, he is a gentleman, and I think given an opportunity to get his programs in place, to get his commissioners, his appointments on board, he will be an outstanding mayor. I have no doubt about
that. So will
that.
the institutions that exist and control power in this city play ball with him?
It probably will be either play ball with me for the next 4 years, or you'll have great difficulty surviving. So I don't think they'll have much choice. I really don't.
You know, his attitude toward criminal justice, we all applauded it,
Mm-hmm.
such as not putting money in police but putting it in education.
Right.
Do you think that will help?
Hopefully it will. Hopefully it will. But, you know, I think in terms of education, and one of my responsibilities is at the Port Authority is I'm liaison with the various schools in our Port District, is that the key to, I think, a quality educational institution is the principal. I am totally convinced that in spite of the system, the principal can turn a school around. I visited a school in Brooklyn a couple of weeks ago that is located in a very disadvantaged area. And I walked into that building and I knew that there was a strong principal. In the first place, it was immaculate. No graffiti around. Hallways were clean. You did not see students wandering around the hall. And this principal has a reputation for being a hard-nosed, no-nonsense principal. Signs up in the hallways, we don't accept and don't approve of gold jewelry and gold teeth and all of that nonsense. And it was reflected. Now, the test scores may not be the highest in the city because it's going to take time for that. But at least the atmosphere for serious learning was there. And I believe that with the new chancellor here in New York, who has an opportunity to tell a principal, you're not here for life, because that system has changed. They no longer have lifetime tenure in a school. They may be principals, but they can be switched around to different schools. I think with that attitude, you're going to, number one, attract principals who are serious, who want to stay in the system, and that you will see a difference.
You know, given the affirmative action, and yet it's my understanding that 80% of the student population in this city is people of color, and yet principals, and most of them are white males.
Right.
Do you think that makes a difference?
Not really. No, not really. Now, the school that I'm referring to has a black principal, a black male principal, but I really don't think that makes a difference. I think where that might be important is perhaps in the classroom. I think the person who reacts or interacts with the students on a day-to-day basis, it's good for the students to see someone of their own. And I'm not saying that white teachers cannot be effective, because they can be. I've had many white teachers in my life who were some of my favorites. But I think for a school system that is 80% black, to have 100% white faculty does not send out the right message to the students. And I don't feel that teachers have to, quote, understand every aspect of a child's life. I don't believe that. Mm-hmm. I think some of the most effective teachers I had were not interested in whether I had breakfast that morning. They did not consider that important to them. It was important to my mother or to me. What they were interested in was that I'd done my homework, that I was going to leave that classroom equipped to compete. And I get a little annoyed, and sometimes I find with teachers who are of a different ethnic group than the students, that they bend over backwards to play social worker, mother, nurse, etc. And what suffers many times is the hard learning that young people need. Young people want discipline. They know that they're in school to learn, and they don't respect teachers who will use all of the excuses that they use to keep from teaching them. They don't respect that. Mm-hmm.
news. Carry this. Noteworthy in a number of ways. We've been working on it for about 4 years. And it's the first of our global exhibitions in that we're an African American museum, and it's very rare for us to do, although we have
Let me ask you this, and I probably asked you the same. How do you differ from the Schomburg?
The Schomburg is part of the library system. The exhibitions are supplemental to their other work. We take our role as collectors and archivists very seriously, and that's why we do things like publish major catalogs and document our exhibitions.
So you're able to make money as a business?
Well, just by nature of the difference between a museum and a library, that's the primary difference. I don't think either of us make money.
And it certainly is an outlet for up-and-coming artists, right?
Yeah, I mean, we really, we get our name from a program, an artist in residence program, wherein we have 3 artists working in our studio on the 2nd floor at any given time.
That's my shirt comes up.
You get your shoes.
Well, you can, now, Lenita, you're going to start out with the museum, and then she may discuss African American art in New York, or the gallery scene, or the museums.
Probably.
I made sure that it would be very...
Probably the same questions I asked you.
Okay, as far as African American
in art here
in New York, and I talked about the artist in residence program and the nurturing role that we take and the need that we feel we're filling.
Okay, just so I don't say something completely contradictory.
No, just so I
we don't know any of them, African American artists. And Anita, you do everything, right? You interview, you shoot.
No, I don't. I'm here as a producer, and my camera person I just couldn't afford to bring.
I see. But so you are able to do everything, though?
Yeah,
that's what you're doing now, right?
Yeah, and I'm not using a clip-on because I like the ambience.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Let me start with a very stupid question. Why do African Americans need their own place to express their art and to show their art?
I think that what we found as an institution and as individuals who are involved in the art world, that it has been one of the areas. Excuse me, you're going to have to make sure that
I'll be on the outside.
that people know at least what's going on. Good. You want me to start
by.
over?
Please.
Gosh.
Wait 5 seconds.
Okay.
Why do African Americans need their own show place? Why can't they go to the Met or more established museums in this country and in New York?
Well, the Studio Museum in Harlem is 22 years old. We have observed during that time, and certainly one of the reasons for our coming into existence was the fact that there were not such avenues open to artists, African American artists. We found that what has happened is that they have been traditionally ignored by established institutions. The major museums in the country were not servicing them, were not exhibiting them, were not writing critical either reviews of their work or historical documents that included them, and they have been excluded traditionally. What has happened was the museum felt that was a critical oversight
and an exclusion, and that we had an obligation to, in fact, document, assess, and exhibit the works of African Americans so that, in fact, they could be judged as a part of the larger contribution of world culture and to be placed within that context. And that is really a vital part of our mission, to do that.
And that seems rather odd, because one of the first things we learned about black art is, of course, the Harlem Renaissance. And here you are in the foundation of it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's so wonderful about our mission is that while it is specific, it covers such a time frame that it really allows us to look at historical works, to look at their thematic development, their formal development, and to be able to examine both major thematic movements as well as individual contributions within the context of those movements. So that becomes very important as well.
You know, right now in the art world, and I just have a passing knowledge of it, okay, I read where certain artworks are being sold for millions and zillions of dollars. Yet I don't see any people of color benefiting from that. Do you think that day will come where our people's artwork would be worth that much?
I think absolutely. I think that every field that African Americans have entered, we have excelled at. I think that once this is a final frontier, as I see it, because it is one which has been considered one of the most intellectual, and it involves an abstract thinking for which we have not been given much credit within this society. And I think that accordingly what happens is it's the last place in which we've gained acceptance. Even among the sciences, there has been a greater degree of penetration and recognition of people of color than within the visual arts especially. I think that it is seen as a kind of final frontier, and I think that we are penetrating it. I think that you have artists who are in the ascendancy, and I think that the forms that are being expressed by African American artists and the nature of the works that they've created are full of a desire to communicate, and they become much richer in content because of that. Because as the Western art world are making statements about the nature of authorship, for example, or authenticity and its value, I think that comes out of the fact that there is a real questioning as to the extent of their own creativity and what kinds of new avenues there are left for them to explore. Whereas with African American artists, I find that there is a great deal of discovery and of a need to communicate, which makes the work rich and full and still full of creativity and still full of authorship and still full of the things that one wants to find in artwork. A spirituality, a sense of a higher communication, a real need to communicate something, to have a story to tell in the first place is, I think, something that's very important and that makes the work of the kind of significance that will warrant its recognition.
I'm glad you brought that up, ma'am, because some people may feel with the problems African Americans are facing in this country, such as drug abuse, gang warfare, teenage pregnancy, the educational gap, art that may not have the type of significance as the 3 R's. Certain educators feel that way as they cut budgets across the country. How would you respond to that kind of analysis?
Well, I think that we at the Studio Museum have been very much engaged in education. We consider ourselves an educational institution. We have been doing programs in the Harlem schools for the last 15 years. And one of the things that we've found and that we've been very much involved in contributing to the entire analysis of how the arts impact on society, what their relationship is. We feel that it's an integral relationship, and what happens is that the arts provide the avenue in which people can understand themselves, in which they can establish a pride in their own being, and then begin to discover their own creative side. Because I think much of the destruction that we see now comes because we have been deprived of creativity, not only among African Americans, but I'm talking about American society generally. When you look at the high rate of crime, for example, that now exists in colleges and universities, when you look at young people who go out and murder someone simply because that is what they have seen on television and because they have no counterbalancing values with which to relate and with which they can identify. So what happens is we feel, especially those of us who are religiously involved in the arts, as I think many of us are, that one gains one's confidence, one understands who one is in the universe as a result of artistic activity. And for me, learning to read is to read literature. That is art. And what happens is the world is opened up to you. For myself, I feel like reading Dostoevsky, for example, gives me a view of a world that I would never otherwise know, and I certainly wouldn't know it through television, and I wouldn't know it as well, I don't think, even to a trip to Moscow. But I think I understand contemporary Russia much more because of having read Chekhov or having read Dostoevsky, and I think that similarly, all of our understanding, if one understands math and its relationship to science, and one understands the creation of the universe and how molecules and how atoms interact and how we are a reflection of that, then that becomes a process that one wants to have and wants to be involved in, rather than one that is alienated, that we are alienated from. So I think that what we're looking at is ways in which one can integrate information and understand the relationship, for example, of how a painting is made and what the interrelationship between understanding perspective, for example, understanding a molecular process and how it creates an oil paint, and how that becomes an invention which is then was employed in the creation of the Renaissance. Or not of the Renaissance specifically, but certainly of Western visual arts and painting specifically. So all of those are interlocked, and I think that as we begin to explore those interconnections and to expose young people to them, I think, and replace those things that have been destroyed, either in terms of an understanding of the family and one's relationship to that, with a new kind of understanding of the universe and our placement in that family. I think that we'll find that a lot of the violence that we've directed toward one another and, toward the world will hopefully dissipate.
Two last questions. Right now there's a controversy in the art world regarding funding and how controversial art should be. As I see black art expressed, some of it may be viewed by mainstream people or folks who are funders as maybe a bit too political, a bit too radical. Do you see that controversy or that train of thought affecting African American artists, especially as their work becomes more political, as art has a tendency to be?
I think that certainly, as any air of conservatism is going to be harmful to African Americans. I think that we may look at the specific instances that have come up and that have resulted in the recent attempts at censorship as being something that is directed toward others, whatever that community is. But I think to the contrary, that any kind of conservative point of view is something that can always be directed toward African Americans, whether it is a matter of the work being overtly political or whether it is seen as something that is that contradicts the values that are established by the larger American society. Even if one is only talking about an emphasis on material values as opposed to spiritual values. And if one then puts an emphasis on the spiritual values, for example, rather than the material, there can be a rejection of work that is, I think, as devastating as any other kind of rejection for any form of censorship. I think that it is certainly something that will affect the funding picture for both individuals and institutions. And I think that the only thing that will counteract that is a real vigilance on the part of both artists, institutions, and people who enjoy the arts, our constituents, who write letters, who advise their congresspeople, because believe me, the people who are the most vociferous are the people who are for the censorship. Those of us who are opposed to it have a tendency to take a very passive position in this. And what all of our elected officials have advised us is that if we want to stop censorship, if we want to encourage the broadest possible assessment of art for the kinds of values that we look to it for, if we want to see the broadest possible avenues of support, the largest numbers of exhibitions, the largest numbers of performances, which I think we all want, we are going to have to demand that. We can't sit back and simply expect that it will happen for us.
My 16-year-old daughter would like to ask me, do you think rap music is art?
Oh, frankly, I have not been enamored of it, because for me, again, and this is so very personal, it's not got any kind of institutional, weight behind this at all. I think that there is probably something very valid in what is being said by rappers, and I think that they are making social commentary in some instances. I think that, and that in some instances, those are valid social comments. Art for me is something very special. It is something that transcends the immediate. It is something that informs me about something that I would not otherwise have been informed of, even if it's not something that is completely cerebral, but something that penetrates in some kind of way that, again, lets me know who I am as a human being and lets me know what I am doing here in this place and in this time. If it does that, then it's art for me, and that can be seen in a myriad ways. And I think that it will appear probably in rap music. For me, it appears in Billie Holiday and Sarah Vaughan and Ella Fitzgerald and a couple of other people. But there are not many people, I think, throughout, whatever the fields are, whether it's painting or music or dance, that actually are blessed with the genius that can really put us in touch with those things.
Ms. Cruz, would you please pronounce your name the way you pronounce it, first and last, and spell it for me, please. Wait 5 seconds.
Okay. Patricia Cruz. Patricia Cruz.
And your official title?
Deputy Director for Programs, the Studio Museum in Harlem.
Woman can close this deal, I thank you, ma'am. You could make me feel so good. I know you could if only you would. Say yeah, now say now. Make me feel good, Miss Aria. I have a feeling that I'm wasting time. I wanna know I can't get you out of my mind. Well, you could be my queen of hearts. All you gotta do is give me all the love going. I can't stand this playing around. Help me out, mama, don't you let me down. You need to kiss me, baby. Tell me something. Gee whiz, I got a right to know. Say yeah, don't say no. Make me feel good. I know how this is. Make me feel good. Make me feel
Can you park here? Okay.
Why, you want to take a
I was going to walk around the corner, but I want to get you out of this traffic before I get on the train, and I wouldn't have to need them.
I don't think anybody was writing this year. She said that she was just walking
think the vendors would allow me to get shots of their boots?
I don't think they'll object to it.
Oh, I do that as a courtesy anyway. Yeah, I have a bunch of interviews scheduled for tomorrow. That hopefully will be the last day.
Will you be welcome to the camera?
Well, I want to, you know, but I'm taking your advice, you know, more than
No, once it's in the case, I don't think you'll have a problem, you know, as long as it doesn't have anything saying that the video, nobody really bug you. Plus you're black, you know, they probably wouldn't even notice you.
I have ID and all that other good stuff. This is what I want my community to see, the streets, how different it is from Portland.
Right.
Now I make music videos, so the way I do that is to take as many different shots as possible and edit them all together. I'm not taking you, sir. I'll take a shot of that.
Was he objecting?
Pardon?
Was he objecting?
No, but I don't want anyone angry with me or you. It's just not worth it, you know? About that. You have one?
I haven't found which one to marry yet, so.
Keep looking.
Boy, is that an insult? Keep
No,
looking.
I'm trying to encourage you. That's what you're looking
Wow.
for.
It's like, I'm not available.
That's what you're doing. Now this is still a Central Park, right?
Yeah, that's it. They don't call it that. But all I'm going to do is close to